Hello YouTube, Mishka Valhalla here, back out in the woods. Wanted to dedicate this video solely on the subject of Jormungandr and Nidhogg, two very particular entities in Norse spirituality, or Norse cosmology as you could say, because they are very important parts of the cosmology as a whole. Jormungandr being the world's serpent, being a very earthly being. Jormungandr translates to earth wand. So this will definitely touch up a lot more on my last video about dragons and serpents. So that's what this video will be dedicated to. It'll be dedicated to a lot of the older earth cults throughout Scandinavia, essentially the people that were bearing the mounds and making serpentine style and draconic rune stones, and essentially it's the type of stuff that Christians were trying to demonize back then. And to an extent some are still trying to demonize now, with the image of the angel slaying the monster being, you know, something draconic or serpent like, but that's what we're going to talk about in this video. First, I wanted to show you some rune stones that you can just look up, really. Rune stones particularly from Sweden. I think a few maybe in Denmark, but a lot of these serpent-like rune stones come from Sweden. The one that I'm going to show you now is of a man transforming into a serpent or a group of serpents. There's a bird in the background. And then the next ones I'm going to show you, or the next one I'm going to show you actually is the one that looks like essentially a Chinese dragon. And above it is a solar cross, and I call it the solar cross because it's the old pagan symbol for the sun. The sun being the cross. You know, the Christians essentially, you know, it being a pagan symbol in the Roman world, you know, represents the Father and the Son. You know, the Son being, you know, the literal sun. So of course they're going to use a cross to represent him. Besides the fact that, you know, they claim that Jesus was crucified, but besides the point. And these rune stones I'm going to show you next, besides that gorgeous, you know, dragon, there are a whole bunch of other ones of dragons and serpents, you know, that are below this, or, you know, not being harmed necessarily, but being, you know, encircling or being around this solar cross symbol. And what's really cool is that it shows us that, you know, that symbol that was essentially used for like Mjolnir, or, you know, to represent the Aesir, the gods of the heavens, the gods of Asgard. And as we know, there are different groups of gods in Norse mythology, and we can't view it in a black and white mentality, because that's not how it was viewed back then. That's not how we should view it today. And in a way, it's not very effective to view everything as, you know, simple. But besides that, Jormungandr and Nidhogg are strongly connected to an ancient, I guess you could call serpent cult, that was very prominent in Scandinavia. These people, you know, were possibly very connected to bones. That's why they buried their ancestors in mounds, so they could be very close to them. And around these mounds, you can find certain rune stones, like the ones I just showed you, of serpents and solar crosses, because there was a sun cult in Sweden, just as much as there was a serpent cult in Sweden. You know, essentially there was kind of a balance between the heavens and essentially what I'm going to talk about being the underworld. And the underworld is what is heavily connected to not only the world serpent, Jormungandr being more of an entity that represents the earth itself. You have Nidhogg, which is the dragon that represents the deep earth, and this dragon being the one that feasts on the corpses of the dead. A lot of people misunderstand it. They go straight to, how Snorri wrote it, which was through a Christian mentality, saying that, oh, that he's eating the corpses of the dead, saying he's punishing the dead, blah, blah, blah. No, this is a much more complex old tradition that is very earth-based in origin. I'm talking gods and spirits that are very focused on the earth itself and the underworld, and including the dragons. And the dragons and the dwarves are very heavily connected, and they are both from the underworld. Nidhogg being the realm of the dwarves, being in the underworld. The dragons, are heavily connected to the earth when it comes to Norse traditions, especially going back before the Viking Age, because during the Viking Age was when people were becoming more and more Christianized. People were starting to worship the sky more than the earth, and the earth itself was essentially demonized because hell turned into a bad place, a place of eternal suffering. And that's essentially was a tactic to convince pagans to convert. And you also see those parallels with how people started to draw demons. Essentially, they started to make them look very draconic like, when to an ancient pagan, a very draconic being would essentially be a natural entity, a very earth-based entity, something that was considered sacred. And you definitely see more totems throughout the world of more mammal-based animals, like wolves and bears, but the serpent isn't talked about a lot today due to the fact that it was demonized by essentially the cultural shift and the conversion to Christianity. So when learning about Jormungandr and Nidhogg through a pre-Christian sense, you need to focus on the fact that they were worshiping the earth as something they wanted to enter both in life and death. They wanted to journey to Helheim. They wanted to go to the underworld, and they wanted to be with their ancestors. Because the underworld essentially, throughout Europe particularly, the underworld was a general place of the dead. And, the heavens wasn't something that was so much focused on. But, there were sky cults throughout ancient Scandinavia, and that's why you have Odin and Tyr and the Aesir, because they represent the heavens. The birds, the mountaintops, the treetops, they're at the top of Yggdrasil, which is the world tree, the center of all life. But Nidhogg, being at the roots of Yggdrasil, he isn't purposefully destroying the roots. He's gnawing at the roots in frustration, while Radatoskr spreads rumor. And essentially, there is sort of a vibe of chaos when it comes to the interaction between the dragon and the eagle on top of Yggdrasil, and the spirit, the Radatoskr, the squirrel. And so he's spreading rumors back and forth, and both entities, both the eagle and the dragon, are destroying the tree itself, because Nidhogg is chewing on the roots, and the eagle is essentially destroying the branches out of frustration, because Radatoskr is spreading false rumors. But Nidhogg, being at the roots, already draws to a lot of important ties to our ancestral lineage. There were so many serpent cults before Christianity, before the demonetization of the underworld, making it more of this dark, unattractive place. Maybe to some it was dark, and that was the fact that they wanted to go there, and to them that was considered attractive. Since ancient times, people felt safe in caves or in dark places because that meant predators or enemies couldn't attack them. But aside from that, the underworld was described as a general place of the dead, much like the living realm. People loved living life. They wanted to live life, and then they wanted to die right, and then they wanted to join their ancestors, and they wanted to watch over their descendants. The ancestral cults are heavily tied to the serpent, and people don't talk about that at all because of what because of all the biases that were put into the myths in the Eddas. When the serpent, just by translating the name Jormungandr, Earth Wand, you can already tell that, there's some significance there, and Jord being the earth itself. And Jormungandr, in a way, is sort of like the masculine earth, the masculine side of Mother Earth, sort of like the protective phallus in a way, or the energy of the earth itself. And it's not just Scandinavia where you see this, throughout ancient, times, there is a symbol of the serpent representing the earth itself, the energies of the earth. And, you could go even further to Asia, and they, of course, talk about dragons. And dragons to them are important. And just like that runestone I showed you in the beginning, I'll show you again, this dragon looks very Asian. Maybe it could have been an idea from trade, but at the same time, this just points to the idea that dragons were well known in Scandinavia, their origins likely being based in the underworld since they are earth-based dragons, and then that being an important part, essentially of spiritual heritage. And you listen, when I talk about spiritual heritage, I'm talking about animism. The people, our ancestors, thought they were much closer to the earth than people think we are now. They felt really close to the animals. Think of it as like being scientists, but like looking at things through a mystical or spiritual point of view. And it's just, yeah, people are shouting. There should be like a football field nearby, but yeah. And dragons overall and serpents are featured, as I said in my last video, all over Norse artwork, especially the dragon ships themselves, the Drakkar. Why name it after a dragon if it's not important? In the Drakkar, the dragons, they had a strong connection to the earth. They were essentially going out and defending their own lineage, defending their own traditions, because that is essentially what was the root of their overall spirituality, is, the serpent and the dragon. And that, I can't say that was for every Scandinavian, but especially the old earth-based cults that were local and native to the land. The non-Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans were the ones that brought the sky-based traditions and essentially integrated them into Norse society, as well as other societies all over Europe. And it was written by the monks at Lindisfarne, considered the first Viking raid, which it technically wasn't, but besides the point. The first Viking raid, they wrote that there were dragons seen flying in the sky, great thunderstorms, and when they arrived, they saw the dragon heads, and I don't know, it's just like I know that they are trying to demonize the Vikings, and technically the raid on Lindisfarne was pretty brutal, but at the...
Hey guys, sorry, I ran out of storage on my camera, so I had to wait till I got home. So where we left off was the raid on Lindisfarne. They said that they saw dragons flying in the sky, thunder and lightning, they saw the dragon-headed ships, in a way, that's them being dramatic, being like, oh, these evil pagans, but also there's another side to it, in a way, it seems, because the dragon being important to the earth-based societies of Scandinavia at the time, in a way it was a retaliation, towards Christianity, because Christianity, had a long history of implementing and forcing itself upon, local populations. I know that, it wasn't all violent, there were some peaceful conversions, but it was usually through trade. It was through the leaders, it was up to the leader, essentially what the society believed. So, they had control over that overall. And yes, there probably was dogmas in Norse society, Dogma wasn't limited to monotheism, there was probably warrior cults, hierarchies, that were pagan, towards Odin or Thor or Tywaz, especially sky deities, hierarchical, order, you know, based, on the worship of a certain deity or a group of deities. It could be a goddess as well, it could be an earth-based deity, but obviously those go further back, to a point, especially more, before the Viking Age, when more sky-based traditions were pouring into Scandinavia through the influence of Christianity. It was a very long process, but obviously, there were a lot of things in between, that made things happen the way they did, and a lot of it was, through certain groups being able to control based on resources, and the people who had the most resources at the time were the Christians, because they inherited essentially the wealth of Rome, so the church particularly had a lot of wealth at their disposal. They were essentially in charge, opposed to more heathen-based communities, pagan-based communities, that were essentially more loose, more there was more of a spiritual freedom overall, but at the same time there were still orders, social orders and hierarchies. There was a caste system, there was like the kings and the jarls, and below them were the carls, the common folk, and then directly above the carls would be the house carls, which would be, or thanes, which would be trusted people of the jarl or the king. And then of course below the carls you had the thralls, which were essentially serfs or slaves, in that time period sense. It's different from American slavery, because American slavery was perpetual and very brutal. I mean, there could have been many brutal instances, during slavery, in ancient times, but the idea of back then was, there was more of a servitude idea. It was more about being able to buy your freedom or work your way towards being free someplace or somehow. But, that wasn't always the case, I mean, obviously, certain details can be argued based on your background. I can't speak for many things regarding American slavery, because it's in my history too, my family being in America for a while now. But what I can say is that the thrall essentially was a slave, somebody who was a serf, somebody who was too poor to pull their own weight, somebody who had to serve somebody in order to survive. Sometimes there were war criminals, so yes, it wasn't, just due to circumstance. It was due to the fact that, circumstance, but due to the fact that they lost the war, and their kingdom or their village fell to the enemy, and now the enemy basically owns all the thralls, or chooses to essentially enslave certain members of whatever royal family they're conquering, or maybe the carls of that region. Who knows? It varies. But besides the point, there's another runestone, or should I say, Norse, Swedish, Gotland stone, of a serpent woman, a snake witch, as they call her, serpent witch, a woman carrying 2 snakes. And there's another statue found from the Minoan culture that I will also show you next. It is also a serpent woman, somebody who is clearly following an earth-based matriarchal tradition and using the serpents, as a tool, essentially to use, the power of the earth at their advantage, maybe to grow crops, maybe to win a conflict or solve something, anything really, there's so many different things per element, so many different things that each element offers, and earth itself was heavily expressed through the serpent, through the dragon, and in the Norse tradition, it really seems like the serpent, not only was an important symbol when using earth-based magic or following earth-based, excuse me, my dog is moving around, earth-based traditions, but hello. She's so silly. So essentially, not only was the serpent probably used for earth-based things, but being an earth-based symbol and ritual tool, an earth wand, just as it's said in Jormungandr's name, the world serpent's name, the serpent could have very well been used through ancestor worship. So essentially the serpent, being a subterranean creature, that will go underground often and will, essentially assemble with its kin, underground. And, from my own personal understanding is that the snakes could very well make their way through the burial mounds and in a way serve as sort of a tool to communicate with the dead, to essentially use the bones of our ancestors, bones being a very important thing in ancestral worship, especially to our heathen ancestors, bones being the vassals of memories, of the previous owners, those were the bones, those were, lived in and used by our ancestors. And essentially the serpent slithering through the bones in a way is an active tool helping us reach to the ancestors. It is a very deep, interesting concept that, I could explore in future videos, but for now I'm just going to leave it at that. But the serpent, is a heavily earth-based symbol, and I've said that a million times in this video, but it is not something to be feared, not something to be considered evil. That's exactly what the church was trying to stamp out, and that's how they were trying to essentially gain their power, was from cutting people off from the earth, cutting people off from their tradition and their ancestors, who were in fact buried in the mountains, buried in the ground. And that is how many people tried to communicate with their ancestors, was through the bones and through the mounds, by gathering in the places of their ancestors so that they could reach to the other side and into the underworld, because that's what the burial mound was essentially. And that's where the serpents live. They live in the underworld, and essentially when they enter the underworld, they become dragons. And in the underworld is a home of the dragons. It's a home of Nidhogg, it's a home of the dwarves, like Fafnir, who turned into a dragon. A wonderful example. And essentially the worm, the Virm, the word Virm, essentially, from my own understanding, has a connection to the word worm, like a little worm, a critter that slithers in the ground. Maybe our ancestors saw a correlation between the worms, the serpents, and the dragons, and how they have an active role in decomposing the bodies of the dead. And that's what Nidhogg is doing. And that's what I was also going to cover on, was the fact that Nidhogg chews on and decomposes the bodies of the dead. And this is something that's seen as morbid, like a punishment, but it's not. This is an animistic understanding, and it's very different from a Christian understanding, or a monotheistic understanding, an Abrahamic understanding. The idea that everything is static and very particular. It's very world denying. It's more focused on another world more so than this world. More about the morality rather than the experience of life and enjoying the fruits of life, to its fullest. Obviously while being an honorable person. But, essentially the worms, they connect to the underworld as well. And, there could be very much that, transition or evolution to an extent from the worm to the serpent to the dragon. Excuse me. And Jormungandr and Nidhogg, go hand in hand. They are very old gods, very old animistic entities, and they're animal based, just like Fenrir and a number of other entities. There are beast-like entities, in the old tradition, Skull and Hati, and then the Jotuns and Garmr. There are so many different beasts and ancient animalistic gods that are mentioned in the Poetic Edda, that have had, they have had to have had, based on archaeology, some sort of an importance to our pre-Christian heathen ancestors, especially before the Viking Age, when things were becoming more human-centric, due to the influence of, more monotheistic religions. But yeah. That pretty much covers everything I wanted to talk about regarding dragons. There will probably be more future videos, but I could talk more about the dragons as a whole. But the Norse dragons in particular, the Earth dragons, are the ones that are heavily connected to Norse tradition and are most talked about. And think about it. It's the roots of Yggdrasil, our ancestors. That's where they are. They are in the underworld, many of them. And, the bones and the serpents, essentially, was how many of these certain traditions communicated with their ancestors and carried on the tradition of ancestor worship and essentially prolonging their existence within the family line. But obviously, there are other things to talk about regarding that. But thank you so much. Please like and subscribe. Stay safe out there. Hail the gods and all the spirits of the land. Cherish your ancestors and cherish nature. It's a changing world and things are getting crazy. So, good luck out there.